Welcome to my commentary on Harriet Jacobs and the slave narrative genre, and also a few points on Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman Too. Some people call it Ain't I a Woman, but Ain't I a Woman Too is often used as a title as well. I'm going to start with Harriet Jacobs and the slave narrative genre. Remember we talked about captivity narratives with Mary Rowlandson and how popular they were in the 18th century in particular to European audiences who saw this as exotic and strange and terrifying and all of those kinds of things, and to people in the cities in the United States as well, who saw it as sensationalist, even though it was real life and not fictionalized. Well, most of it probably wasn't. The attraction of that sort of thing, you can go through a lot of different reasons why it was appealing to people. Of course, the horror of it. We talked about how this was a sort of a culture that was seen as being alien and completely different value system. But also just the shock value of it, and also the idea of being taken away from the world that you lived in and immersed in a world that was alien to you. Here's what I think is really interesting about the slave narrative, and Harriet Jacobs is, of course, a prime example of that, and that is you get to see it from the other perspective. That is to say that, yes, it's a captivity narrative, but it's a captivity narrative that's told from the perspective of a person who is a captive within the dominant society that we are living in, right? Not some alien culture. We are seeing our culture as an alien culture through the eyes of the captive. That's what's so different. You look at Rowlandson and you say, oh, okay, so this was totally foreign to her, and these people were not of her own culture, and it took her a long time to try to come to terms with that psychologically, spiritually, morally, all those things. All that's true, but with the slave narrative, this is someone that's telling us about our culture, about being a captive within our culture. And so that places a whole different emphasis on it. And it also is one where the narrator, the person who is enslaved, is offering an implicit critique of our culture, of the dominant culture. It's not contrasting our culture with some other culture and saying, gee, aren't we better? Or thank goodness we don't live like that, or all of that sort of thing. It's critical of the culture. So got to bear that in mind, that when you look at, and by the way, Frederick Douglass wrote in this genre, of course, and so many others. There were just many other slave narratives. And next we're going to be doing Uncle Tom's Cabin, which isn't a slave narrative, it's a novel, but it drew a lot on the popularity of slave narratives. Now, and like I said, there were just dozens and dozens of these that came out. Now, of course, it was a country that was exceedingly divided, and we'll talk about that in the part 2 of this, and how the country led up to civil war based on all of the stuff that was going on. We all know that from American history class, but this is very important to remember as well, and that is that, and I'm not using this word in a pejorative sense. I'm using it in its original sense, and that is, these were used also as propaganda, meaning politically motivated speech, politically motivated narratives that were designed to change the country's opinion. And in some regards, they probably did. Nowhere near so much as Uncle Tom's Cabin did, and we'll talk about that next commentary that I offer to you. That was the big game changer. To a large extent, some of these slave narratives, like Harriet Jacobs and Frederick Douglass and a couple of others, were, I won't say that they were preaching to the choir, but they really were very popular among people who were already opposed to slavery. You can only imagine that people who were in favor of slavery absolutely ignored it, criticized it all the time, everything you can imagine. This particular narrative, because Lydia Maria Childs was the editor, raised a lot of eyebrows, and people said, how could a woman who had lived her life as a slave with very limited literacy skills write like this? Well, okay, so let's be fair, and let's also be honest. There's no way that Lydia Maria Childs simply transcribed this for her. There's no question that this was a collaborative effort. But this is no different than your typical politician or celebrity today that writes their memoirs. They always have a ghostwriter or someone who is an editor and using that term in very, very loose terms. Not just somebody who proofreads, but somebody who basically helps write it for them. If you think for a moment that Bill Clinton's most recent novel, where he collaborated with a famous novelist, was all Bill Clinton's writings, or that George Bush or Barack Obama's texts aren't heavily influenced by the assistance of some professional writer, you're wrong. So this is not something new, and it's not something scandalous. And of course, this woman, a very limited educational opportunity, had some assistance. But that doesn't take away from the fact that what she's telling is, as far as we all can tell, totally genuine. And factually accurate. Now, Frederick Douglass, on the other hand, there's no reason to believe that he had a lot of assistance. That's a different case entirely. But of course, he had a different life experience. He had different sorts of situations. Both of them had something of a speaking career. Douglass clearly had much more of a famous speaking career. Jacobs was not so much of a public speaker as Frederick Douglass. So I'm trying to set the background and the backdrop of this. I want to also dive in and say, when you read about her childhood, it wasn't all that atypical. It wasn't typical. It wasn't totally atypical. There were a lot of varying degrees and different types of relationships that African Americans who were enslaved had with white families. And sometimes, especially in early childhood, she says, I didn't even know I was a slave for a few years until I was sold. I had no idea that there was this important distinction between me and the other children, between me and the white children. Part of that is because she's biracial. And a lot of it, though, is the fact that it was a fairly common practice for some African-American slave children to be playmates and companions of white so-called master children. And then at a certain age, that's when the distinctions become very, very clear. But as playmates, they just didn't think very much of it. Sometimes those lines were very, very clear and very sharply drawn. Sometimes that it was never a positive thing, obviously. But at the same time, there was more interaction than what you and I might think from Hollywood, for example. There were all kinds of different sorts of domestic, configurations in a way. And so when we try to sort of create this scenario where, it's all this sort of gone with the windish kind of thing, there were horrific abuses, and she details them in here. There were also situations where, even though it was a situation of power and control and lack of freedom, that believe it or not, it is somewhat plausible to think that at least as a small child, she didn't know at first what her status exactly was. It was only when she finds out later, oh my gosh, this is what slavery means. So you can't be completely shocked by that, I think. The two big themes that I want to kind of highlight here, and maybe you'll want to offer it a little bit in your commentary as well, are the themes of romantic love and the problematic nature of romantic love for the slave, and the spiritual sanctity of the American family, because these are, at least the second one of these is going to come up in Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's exceedingly important. First and foremost, what Jacob's text reveals in full daylight and in its sort of naked truth is the dirty little not so big secret, or not so secret truth, that is, of sexual abuse within slavery and the institution of slavery. Her very complexion, her very multi-ethnic racial background is a testimony to sexual abuse. And of course, her story with this Dr. Flint, whose real name is James Norcom, real guy, right? Down in the left-hand corner there, you can see that when she escaped, this is the actual ad that Norcom placed to recover her. That's the ad. Harriet, that's her. When she was 21, she tried to escape, and he put out an ad to capture her again. And clearly, his interest in her is sexual. His interest in her is having power over her. And this causes her not to be able to pursue a romantic relationship with the man of her choice. She says in the Lover chapter, "Why does the slave ever love? Why allow the tendrils of the heart to twine around objects which may at any moment be wrenched away by the hand of violence? When separations come by the hand of death, the pious soul can bow in resignation and say, 'Not my will, but thine be done, O Lord.' But when the ruthless hand of man strikes the blow, regardless of the misery, he causes it is hard. Of the miseries he causes, it is hard to be submissive." So romance for the slave is not possible. In fact, a lot of people don't know this, but marriage vows for slaves in many jurisdictions in the South read not "till death do we part," but "till death or distance do we part." That's a real marriage vow that slaves were exchanged. Very shocking to us today to think in those terms, that you would sell a woman and a man apart that were married, or sell their children, but that's the case. What she is honing in on here very clearly is that she was denied the choice of her lover, right? She was not allowed to make that decision. And that's something that is a women's rights issue in the 19th century. We had moved away largely from this women as chattel notion in the 19th century. We had moved away from this medieval idea that women were the property of their fathers and could be married off any which way they wanted to. We were not living in 19th century America. We were not living in a world where women had zero choice. It's not as though that they had the same choices they do today, okay? But I'll give you an example. When Henry David Thoreau asked a woman to marry him when he was a young man, she was in love with him. He was in love with her. There was no question about that. I think most biographers are clear on that. She goes to her father, and her father says, "I'm not going to let you marry that guy. He's a good-for-nothing and a poet, and I'm not going to let you marry him." And she came back and said, "I can't marry you." He did not pursue that, and she did not rebel not because the law said her father could deny her. She could have run off. She wouldn't have. It was not a question of whether she could have disobeyed her father. Legally, she could have married the man of her choice. It's that a young woman at that time wouldn't have, right? But neither would she have, most women anyway, neither would they have simply sat back and allowed their father to just pick a mate for them with no choice involved at all. So in the 19th century, you're in this really interesting transition period where women are exerting themselves more in terms of their choice of spouse. They have, at the very least, in many cases, veto power. Okay, that was emerging in the 18th century, was the rise of the middle class and the bourgeoisie, and you certainly had that in the 19th century. It was still expected that young women would have to get the approval of their fathers, that they would have to get the approval sometimes of their older brothers or even younger brothers. But it was not a situation where very often, I'll say that, not a situation very often where a father would say, "Oh, I met this guy, his name is Henry, and you're going to marry him, and that's that," and then they would just have to do what they were told. There was this emerging sense that women have the right to choose their husband, particularly since, and this, as the argument went among many women's rights advocates, particularly since the law gave the husband quite a bit of control. At the very least, she needs to be able to consent to who that person is that's going to have that kind of authority and control over. So understand the backdrop of this. She's tapping into that when she makes the argument that one of the worst things about this whole situation was that she was not given a choice of who to marry, of who to love, etc. That's playing into particularly the white female readership's concept of that's just wrong. A woman should have the right to choose who she marries, particularly since once she is married, she doesn't have that many rights afterwards, right? So, but what's really big is she lays bare and she exposes the sexual aspect, the sexual abuse aspect of this in all its detail. And she even, the confrontation, the violence with Dr. Flint. He's going to build this little place for her, and she knows exactly what this little place is going to be for. She knows exactly why it's away from everybody. He doesn't want the community to see that he's carrying on, and his wife is particularly vile and abusive and mean, and because of the jealousy, because of the shame that her husband, and she can't do a thing in the world about it, her husband is leading this affair if you will, essentially this sexually abusive rape relationship with this young woman, and she can't stop it. And it's got to be the talk of everybody, right? About how and that was exceedingly common, so common, in fact, you're going to think this is unbelievably diabolical, but this was the law. The law was at the time in most jurisdictions that the child of a slave followed the condition of its mother. The legal status of the mother, not the father, determined the child's fate as to whether that child would be free or slave. Now that's a very interesting thing. Why do you suppose that is? Because when a white man had sexual relations with one of his African-American slave women and she became pregnant, as long as that child that was born to the woman followed her legal status as a slave and not his as a free man, he was free to get rid of the evidence. That is to say, he could sell that child and get rid of it. He would do that for convenience. His wife would even encourage him to do it so that it wasn't a shame upon the family. Do you see how sick and corrupted this is? This is really important. And that's why Jacob's big argument in this text, and you're going to see it even to an even greater extent in Uncle Tom's Cabin, a little bit less so with the sexual, but certainly in terms of slavery assaults the traditional family. This direct address to the white female reader, where she is really walking a tightrope here, because one, it's Victorian, okay? They have very strong beliefs about sexual propriety and impropriety during the Victorian era. So if she's going to say, I had sex outside of wedlock, I had a child outside of wedlock, etc., she's got to be very careful, because some readers are going to say, well, I'm not going to read this because this is a fallen woman. This is a disgraceful woman. This is et cetera, et cetera. And this is not men who are going to do this so much as it is other women. But she knows that there are going to be readers who are going to bristle at that and say, I can't read this. This woman is disgraced. She's a disgraceful person with no morals, etc. Like her grandmother treated her. Even her grandmother rejects her, right? She needs to build empathy is what I probably should say. And she does so when she's directly addressing the white female readership. And she says, but O ye happy women, whose purity has been sheltered from childhood, who have been free to choose the objects of your affection, whose homes are protected by law, do not judge the poor desolate slave girl too severely. And she's telling them, look, you have the protection of law. You get to choose your husband. You don't have to worry about somebody banging your door down and taking you away in the middle of the night, and there's nothing you can do about it. At least you have the law. You can seek justice in the courts. She says, if slavery had been abolished, I also could have married the man of my choice. I could have had a home shielded by the laws, and I should have been spared the painful task of confessing what I am now about to relate, but all my prospects had been blighted by slavery. So she's setting it up. She's about to confess that she had a child outside of wedlock, and to you and I, it's like, well, I mean, that happens all the time, and maybe it's not, frequently the ideal situation, but at the same time, it's a thing that life goes on, and, you make the best. But not in the 19th century. Oh no, this would have been the kiss of death for a lot of readers. She's got to be careful how she reveals this, but yet she needs to reveal it both to convey the truth and to make a greater point, and that is that slavery empowers the slave owner with too much power. Places too much power into the hands of a mere mortal. It gives godlike power to a human being. And that's going to be what she argues. She argues that that's the case, and that because of that, it is corrosive and destructive to the traditional family. Because nobody can wield that kind of power over another human being without basically giving into the temptation to be a tyrant. Right? It's what the nation was founded on, that one person, one man shouldn't have that kind of, the king shouldn't have that kind of authority over people, that law, not men, should rule. And so she's making that argument in a microcosm here, and she's saying this is what it leads to. It leads men who otherwise, if the law were in effect, and if the law were fair, and if the law applied to everyone, including the African Americans, then no person would be allowed to get away with this kind of behavior. But because the law sanctions the behavior, you can't be, absolute power corrupts absolutely as it goes, right? And it corrupts sexually, or it corrupts in terms of violence and all kinds of things. She says, I wanted to keep myself pure, and under the most adverse circumstances, I tried hard to preserve my self-respect, but I was struggling alone in the powerful grasp of the demon slavery, and the monster proved too strong for me. I felt as if I were forsaken by God and man, as if all my efforts must be frustrated, and I became reckless in my despair. So she says, pity me and pardon me, O virtuous reader. You never knew what it was like to be a slave, to be entirely unprotected by law or custom, to have the laws reduce you to the condition of a chattel, that means property, entirely subject to the will of another. You never exhausted your ingenuity in avoiding the snares and eluding the power of a hated tyrant. You never shuddered at the sound of his footsteps and trembling within hearing. She's trying to make the reader, the white female reader, feel what she felt, right? Imagine a situation where your abuser, your rapist, could continue to abuse you again and again, and there's nothing you could do about it. Nothing. What would it be like to have to come home every night and there he is? And it's just a horrifying thing. She's trying to say, focus on that, not on the fact that I ran to the arms of another man who was the only person that could potentially shield me from this. I know I did wrong. No one can feel it more sensibly than I do. The painful and humiliating memory will haunt me to my dying day. Still, in looking back calmly on the events of my life, I feel that the slave woman ought not to be judged by the same standards as others. That's what she's saying. Just judge me based on my circumstances, not on some absolute moral yardstick. And so this is the big thing. I was a poor girl, only 15 years old, and her grandmother basically says, get out. She has to go and hide in an attic there's an illustration down there what the attic of the home for an extended period of time to escape this man's abuse. It really is an amazing narrative. And as far as anybody knows, a lot of the historical research on it has borne it out to be very, very truthful. She hasn't exaggerated in any regard. Her grandmother, she did not say, I forgive you, but she looked at me lovingly with her eyes full of tears. She laid her old hand gently on my head and murmured, poor child, poor child. That's all she can get. The most she can get is pity, not protection. The horrible abuse of the family essentially terrifies her and terrorizes her. She finally gives us the tale of how she was freed and how that came about. But she wasn't freed until she was 40. And that's in an era where your lifespan was not that long. That was an astonishing long period of time to have to be subject to that. There are many other things in the narrative. We could go on, but I've got to stop this video and move on to Sojourner Truth and to talk about slavery in general, set up things for Uncle Tom's Cabin. But those are the two things that I really want you to focus in on a lot, because that's where she's trying to make a connection with the reader, right? A lot of ways you can look at the text, but the two things that I'm really interested in this that I kind of want to highlight for you is that these are the two ways she's trying to make a connection with the reader, and the reader being predominantly white and female. She thinks this is how I can get them to understand. In the next video, we'll talk about Sojourner Truth and the anti-slavery movement and what led to the Civil War in a nutshell.